This is the Alembic Files, and I'm Al.
I'm Theo.
What we're going to do today is lay some baseline down for the message we want to get across. We've been down this road before, quite often, but not in this particular manifestation. But entitled the series, Once Upon a Time, ... because we're dealing in America with a fairy tale about ourselves. And we'll explain that further as we go on, or else we have nothing at all to discuss. But there's plenty of reasons that we say that and examples that underlie that. Really, the problem in America is Americans are propagandized into believing they can't be propagandized. And so here we go. One thing I'd like to say, Theo, and we want to just start real quick from the beginning, and that is even the notion that we have about countries are necessarily places where, to borrow from the American lexicon, huddled masses yearning to be free went to find safe haven. But that's really not the reason why. There's nation building. And if you don't mind, you want to take it from there?
Well, as you've said before, the Statue of Liberty is really a great big help wanted sign. It was a new market that got opened up. That's all America was about. That's all it's ever about. In our daily lives, we know the meaning of the phrase, it's all about the money, or when we're looking after the truth of something small, we'll say, follow the money. We need to expand that. I mean, that explains all of history. It's about the money. And Jesus said, the love of money is the root of all evil. I think he knew what he was talking about. The United States was founded as a new market. Now, in the beginning with the Pilgrims, yes, they wanted religious freedom. But in order to get that, in order to be able to have the finances to get over here, they had to sign some contracts with the king, some binding mercantile contracts to get over here. And those contracts are still binding. The I-Man goes into that. He looked into the contracts of his particular state. I think James Montgomery did as well. Those original contracts, they're still around.
What Theo's referring to is the Informer has written a number of books about the way things really are. What Theo just said was that he went back and took a look into the very roots of, if you will, the creation of North Carolina. James Montgomery also has written one book in particular, A Country Defeated in Victory. The writings of both these individuals you can access on thinkorbeeaten.com. Just look for their names, and you can hit that link. Go ahead.
The James Montgomery book that deals with largely the Revolutionary era is The United States is Still a British Colony. With his later, actually he may have written it before, with his book A Country Defeated in Victory, he deals more with the late 1800s and especially the early 1900s.
And again, those writings can be accessed on thinkorbeeaten.com. I would really encourage you to take a look at it because reading this kind of stuff, in this case, it is pretty interesting, and it also allows you to process it and go look elsewhere for research that supports it, or in their cases, a lot of times, in fact, if not all the times, they will supply the sources from which they drew that information, so you can go take a look for yourself and find out that, in fact, it is what they said it is.
The King George, well, and as you've noted many times with me, when it came to writing the Treaty of Paris at the conclusion of the American Revolutionary War, King George wrote the terms of that treaty. Since when does the loser ever draw up the terms of the treaty? That should be a red flag to historians, but they've missed on that one.
Yeah, if you, in fact, we might provide some of the links for this with the audio, so that it'd be quicker for you to take a look. But the treaty to which Theo refers, in the very beginning, it's very interesting that one of the things that King George would call himself, as he lists his many titles, is the Elector of the Holy Roman Empire. That's very interesting. But as he goes on and writes the terms, it's true. He is the one that's dictating, not the one that's ceding anything. Now, just consider this. Unlike other land purchases that this government made, most notably the Louisiana Purchase, for instance, and the Gadsden Purchase, and a few others, we never purchased the land from England. We never did. Oh, so people say, but we won them as spoils of war. No, we didn't. And that treaty makes it very clear that we didn't win anything except the right to call the colonies states or estates.
And as James Montgomery and the Informer show, King George, he gave Americans at that time, he gave them individual freedom, excuse me, but he never gave up the mineral rights. In other words, he never gave up the land, and that's what really counts.
Yeah, the riparian rights and all that go along with it. When you read that treaty, it was basically business as usual, with the only exception that the states could call themselves such. They were allowed to do that, and that's it. That's all that was granted. Also,
King George, I think it's Montgomery that goes into this, King George never could have given up the land. That was an investment that the crown made, the crown and the king. And, you know, the royals, they're not stupid. Long ago, they passed this law of mortmain, which prevented, in the case some idiot king should come along and want to give everything away, he couldn't. They have a law built in that says no king or queen can give away anything that rightfully belongs to his posterity. Isn't going to happen, never can happen. The only way you could do that is to conquer and kill the king completely. That's the only way that America actually could have won that Revolutionary War.
Yeah. The point is that that land was not ceded to the new United States. It was not purchased, and so what conclusion would you come to? We're still tenants, if you will, on this land. And so, one of the things we're not going to get into today, but people, especially the Tea Party individuals, they kind of get it because now they realize that the Federal Reserve is a private bank. But they don't understand the totality of that. They think they can just get rid of the Federal Reserve. No. They think that the president's wagged the Federal Reserve. No. The Federal Reserve has as its head an employee of the World Bank, not of the United States federal government. So the point is that we had this war supposedly to throw off taxation without representation, but the taxation never stopped. And that's one of the things that England wanted to get straight with the founders or the framers, whatever you want to call them. And that is, this is business as usual, and we do have an investment, and we want a return on it. And we'll go into this perhaps the second time we come together, and that is the Constitution was struck to protect the founders and the framers and to allay any fears or any anger that would arise over the money not going west to east as it had been throughout so many decades.
One of the more fascinating things Montgomery does, I think this was Montgomery, he lists them, this labyrinthine forms and procedures. It takes up a couple of paragraphs in his book. And what he shows you is how today's IRS 1040 form, ultimately what you're paying goes back to Britain. Same as always.
Yeah, people are probably saying we're full of crap and the jaws are dropping on the ground, their eyeballs are popping, but take a look. And that's where I was driving at.
Well, that's that proverb, that proverb, what is it? I think it's 18:17, 17:18, something like that, where it says, he who answers a matter before he hears it It is folly and shame unto him. So they need to go check it out instead of just dismissing it, or they're being foolish.
Well, one of the things that the Internet has done, and probably is kind of self-defeating or counterproductive to people understanding exactly the way the world really is, and that is there is so much information, and of course we're contributing to it right now, but there's so much misinformation and disinformation, and as a result, usually, and of course you have the human tendency not to want to believe what is unpleasant, and that's the way you and I both approach this. We didn't like what we came up with, but there was no arguing that it was what it was, and so that's all we want to share. This is not touched upon by really anybody. Even the so-called patriots in the United States have no idea that the Constitution was not written for them, and that they have no constitutional protections, and also we don't have any rights. We have privileges, and that's also stated in the Constitution, but people don't want to believe that's what it says. When it talks about habeas corpus, it states that it's a privilege, not a right.
Which historically has been taken away several times in America.
Yeah, that and posse comitatus, folks, give me a break, will you? What the federal government does is what it wishes to do, and nobody stops it. And you can talk about all kinds of rights and such, but when it comes to messing with the feds in any way, shape, or form, you are without any allies. Not the court and not the law. But that's another day. But one of the other things I wanted to touch upon, if you mentioned Scripture at the very beginning, so people are thinking, oh, okay, what are these guys, crypto Christians and such? No, but there's another thing that's going on in America, and it stays just long enough. It's just ingrained enough to make people feel okay about the things that this country does. So what am I saying? There's this feeling amongst the Christian community, I would agree, that this country has some kind of special relationship with God, that there's some kind of special dispensation for this country because pilgrims and Puritans came over, and probably easily the majority were Christians in whatever shape or form. I don't know. A lot of people call them Christians who only pop up, for Christmas and Easter, and that's about it. Nominal Christians, I guess we could call them. But that's not the case at all. There's no relationship between God and our government or our country. Now, that's made very clear in Scripture, but it's something Christians kind of blow over because however they got that notion, it did not come out of Scripture. It comes out of our indoctrination through the public fool system, and, of course, in public works, and I should say public, popular works, mass consumption, textbooks, and entertainment for the most part. And, of course, it's just enough trappings left in our government and such where, they'll say, so help me God, or you swear on the Bible. There's just enough of that there to make it seem like, oh, we're really a godly country, and we have to become more godlike in order to maintain our prosperity and this favored status that we have. But that's baloney, and that does not come out of the Bible. The other thing, what I'm saying is it's convenient, is because how Christian was it for the military in this country, the government of this country, to conduct a genocide for arguably over a century? Some would say more than that. How did that sit with Christians? I never could understand that God would smile upon that. That, what is it, the Native Americans are just in the way, they're collateral damage. The other thing is, of course, and we'll talk about this later, this country's been at war forever. And there's something wrong with a country that would be at war or engaged in some kind of conflagration somewhere, arguably since the Spanish-American debacle. So I know I've said a lot there, but there is this thing that somehow everything that we do has the imprimatur of God, and that is just not so, and it does not come out of the Scripture, which should be the final word on it. And that's a lot that I've said there, but I'm going to throw it to you, Theo. Your thoughts on this?
The Nazis learned a lot from America. Now, it's going to sound shocking to historically illiterate Americans, which most of us are anymore, but it's a fact that Hitler looked to the genocide of the Native American Indians as a precedent for his own genocide, and he brought that up many times, and that was his justification. That's where he learned it. That's where he learned to genocide. Or again, at least that's where he justified it. And also, the good old Roman salute of the good old Heil Hitler, the Heil Hitler salute. That came. The Nazis did not invent that. Yes, it goes all the way back to Rome, but however, the Nazis more directly learned that from America.
By the way, I just went to that site yesterday because I hadn't been there in a while.
Uh-huh.
As you well know, and I think you interviewed him as well, there is a lawyer in Tampa by the name of Rex Curry, Curry, and he is a staunch anti-socialist, anti-communist, and he has a website, rexcurry.net. And as soon as you hit that link, you'll come to a bit of a history of socialism in this country. And I'm not going to get into this thing about, well, socialism is good, it's bad. It's whatever people want it to be, or governments want it to be. So let's let that lie for now. But the thing is, he also goes back and shows what the original Pledge of Allegiance salute was, or whatever kind of flag waving or raising exercise they had out in the schoolyard before the school day. And you will see that it is what you could call the Roman salute, or what we've come to know as what the Nazis used. That's what we did in this country. And he has plenty of photos documenting where it was, when it was, and that's pretty much the way things were until Hitler picked it up. And then that kind of thing just faded away for obvious reasons in the United States. But, as far as symbology goes, too, Theo, I mean, you think about it. Take a look at your money. Take a look at the one side of the Great Seal. I mean, the Nazis used an eagle. We use an eagle. The eagle has in its talons the fasci of wheat, fascism. It's the same stuff. So we are not that far removed from the Nazi influence. In fact, if anything, and you know that we've discussed this in many ways, that after World War II, the spirit of Nazism crept into us, and we are about to pay a price for that, as this particular Reich is on rocky ground and is not long for this world.
And think about it. Every country that goes to war believes that God is on their side. At least the soldiers on the ground do, most of them. And you have Christian evangelicals sending their sons, and now shamefully enough their daughters, over to be cannon fodder for this NWO thing. But it was the same thing with Nazi Germany. The German soldiers, most of them, who were invading Poland, they thought that God was on their side. Of course, they all do it. And so they're doing it again.
Yes. Like we said before, and I'm thinking about this because we're recording this the day before the Super Bowl. And if there's anything that makes me more uncomfortable is the spectacle that the halftime show has become. And, of course, there is in this country interwoven this government, or the state, you could call it, the military, and entertainment or sports. There's always a lot of actually unjustifiable examples and parallels between athletics, the events, the contests, and war. I remember, though, that somebody put it very succinctly and got it right. There was a famous pitcher in the major leagues by the name of Bob Feller, who's a no-nonsense guy. His heyday was in the 40s, early 50s. And he had been in World War II. And, of course, when he started to hear this bit about athletes saying, well, we're going to war, or he's the kind of guy you'd like to go to war with. I don't know if you remember this, Theo, but Feller said, anybody who says that sports is war has never been to war.
Yeah.
However, we have the national anthem. We have military presence, overflying of jets and such. And it's like, if you really stop and think about it, what does that got to do with playing a ball game?
Yeah, exactly.
It's not that big a deal, but when does this thing about playing the Star-Spangled Banner or doing the Pledge of Allegiance before any athletic contest come into being? What is that supposed to mean? What's the connection?
It's an advertisement for the Army, Navy, Air Force, and Marines, that's what it is.
Well, yeah, and there's a glorification of the military happening now, and I'm not trying to be disrespectful at all, but there seems to be an embracing of the soldier more and more. It's become more palpable in this country, and I'm okay with it. I mean, I'm not saying that's bad, but it seems to fly in the face of the way veterans were treated from World War I onward after they've done their service.
From what I've heard, it flies in the face from how they're treated now from the VA when they get back if they're wounded.
Yeah, that is true, but I'd have to say that as far as what pops up, just in our culture, there's more and more, like, for instance, every soldier that goes over is called a hero now. All right, now, is there a problem with that? Well, maybe not necessarily, but the thing is, if somebody goes in voluntarily, and perhaps because there's not a lot of good jobs out there, is that really being a hero? Well, I understand the whole bit about defending your country and that, right, but this is all I'm saying is that there is somewhat of an elevation of the warrior and the warrior class.
And those guys who fight over there, who are signed up for the service, it's not even just about them anymore. We have a bigger and bigger presence of mercenaries like Blackwater fighting right next to them who make a lot more money, make them very, very jealous.
Yeah, they thus changed their name because of some of the associations the company had with certain, shall we say, unpleasant episodes, both in the United States and abroad. But that is true. Still in all, what I'm saying is that we're preparing a generation or more for perhaps looking upon the military more favorably or being forced into it because of a horrible job market, and that is to beef up a military that will be used for a future and last World War. But getting back to the origins of this country and this myth, or as George Carlin said, it's the American dream because you got to be asleep to believe it. Let's take a look back also, not at the Constitution necessarily and how that came into being and what got kicked to the curb to make room for it, but the founders themselves. I'll say this, shoot at it if you will. If you remember going through the public fool system, did it not seem that the founders almost were like demigods? It's like they were beyond human in a sense in their like goodness and their intelligence and their wisdom. I don't know. What was your take? Maybe that didn't happen with you because you were quite a bit behind me.
Yeah, absolutely, they were. And that is also how they are portrayed in our national Capitol buildings. There's that dome, and I forget exactly which dome, in Washington, D.C., but on the inside of it, Washington, I think the painting is even called this, but I know that Stephen Michael Schroeder has called this the apotheosis of Washington. There's a famous painting up on the ceiling there, and it depicts Washington as a god.
Yeah. Now, was there a problem with that?
Yeah, the man was an elitist, insider trading scumbag.
You left out realtor.
Yeah. Well, that's what I mean by he was an inside trader in realty, and this comes from Gustavus Myers, I think the best historian America ever produced. He documents how, before it was determined where the capital of the country was going to be placed, there were a few insiders who knew that it was going to be placed at what is now Washington, D.C., and originally was called Rome, interestingly enough. But George Washington was one of these men and a few others, and they hurriedly bought up all of the cheap property in what is now Washington, D.C. Then suddenly the Congress at the time declared declared their plans. D.C. would be the capital, and Washington and his cronies made a bundle.
The particular Myers work that you extracted information from Is that one of the books that's online?
Yes, they're all online at, that Yamaguchi site.
All right, I'll put the link up for it. So people can read that for themselves. Now, they've never heard of Gus Myers.
And I think that particular documentation came from the history of the Supreme Court of the United States.
Right. He has a few others that are accessible. That would be what? The History of the Great American Fortunes?
Yeah, that's probably the one he's most known for. Then he's got the history of the Supreme Court, the history of Tammany Hall, and he's also got the history of Canadian wealth, which I've never read.
Yeah, take off, eh? Who cares?
Well, he's going to obviously document the Bronfmans up there.
I tell you what, just for now, can you give folks a thumbnail of Myers and the period in which he wrote? Because nobody obviously had got a whiff of him.
The muckrakers, the turn of the 20th century, the very late 1800s, early 1900s, which in some ways was kind of like the dying gasp of consciousness in this country. You had quite a few writers who were alerting the country, and they were, I would say, linked to the populist movement of William Jennings Bryan. And they were trying to warn people of what the robber barons were doing. The Rockefellers, the Carnegies, the Morgans,
Vanderbilt,
the Vanderbilts, the Astors, the Goulds, the Pews, all of these guys. And you had Ida Tarbell, who was rightfully exposing the criminal takeover of the Rockefellers. You had, the one that they teach the most because, he's the safest to teach because he wrote he based it in fiction, and he doesn't name a lot of specific names. So the one that's most famous today, that's the safest to teach, is Upton Sinclair.
Yep.
But
True.
Gustavus Myers was another one, and he's kind of forgotten of the bunch. If I spent more time, I could think of some more of the names of these muckrakers. But yeah, Gus Myers, man, wow, I don't know how he found the time to research all of this stuff, but he was prolific, and he was meticulous. And if you hear about him, if you come across him referenced at all today, and you do once in a while in books, and I know Ferdinand Lundberg even references him once in a book of his. But you know what they will never do? They will never criticize Gus Myers' facts. He's never been proven wrong, any of his claims. However, what they criticize about him is his tone, his constantly critical tone. Well, sometimes, as you have been wont to tell me, sometimes, I'm sorry, the news just isn't good. And what if, historically, we have been run by a bunch of plutocrats who deserve to be criticized? And Gus Myers does a great job of that. I think he died in around 1940. He was born in 1860, something like that. He led a pretty long life.
Yeah, he was. Do you remember the last work he put out?
Well, I have been told, but I've never come across it. I've been told at the time of his death, he was working on a book about the history of religious hypocrisy and where the money goes in the religious systems in America. I've never come across any title of it or anything like that, but that's what I've been told by someone, and that it's unfinished. But I wish I could come across that. That would be fascinating. As far as I know, that was what he was working on. If there was something else, you got to tell me.
No, what I was doing as you were speaking is I don't have the Yamaguchi website where those books can be had. I went to archive.org, but I will go to the Yamaguchi because the reason I'm thinking about this is that there is a excerpt of a quote by the New York Times at the time that Myers was writing, and it actually kind of gave him as much as a mainstream newspaper would do, kind of an okay. Like, yeah, all right. They try to demonize him, but they wouldn't pat him on the back either. And the thing I have to laugh at, too, just to digress for a second, I went back in the New York Times archives to see how they treated the idea of the Federal Reserve System and of the main Federal Reserve Bank being housed in New York City. And we were all told, we were all beaten over the head with the fact that the Times is kind of like the paragon of journalism. But during that time that the Federal Reserve was trying to be sold to the people, if you will, what would pass for an op-ed piece now was front page news, in other words, masquerading as hard news, which it was not. It was subjective. It was very much opinion. And I couldn't believe how much they just gushed over the Fed. So here you have, by the second decade of the 20th century, you already have the newspapers, the influential ones, being bought out by money and by power. At least, let's put it this way. It wasn't all that overt in a sense, but it is chronicled that Rockefeller got together a number of influential publishers, newspaper publishers in the United States, and basically said, this is how it goes. And so we've not really had a free press in anybody's lifetime that could hear this show right now. It already had happened. And if you were to go back in the archives and read for yourselves, you see exactly what I mean. And what's really interesting about that as well, one last aside, and that is the whole creation of the Federal Reserve was unconstitutional. But the ones who gave it up was Congress, who was charged with what? Coining money and was affixing a value thereof, something like that. Well, they gave that up to the Fed. And that was
Myers documents that pretty much all through American history, the Congress and also the Supreme Court, they're bought and sold. They're the plutocrats, the people who really run the country actually own these men. They're puppets of them. It's the same as today, of course, but it's always been that way.
Yeah, there's never any shortage of people and organizations that will do anything for the money, which is kind of the way we came into this whole thing, saying that in the end, it's not about freedom, it's about business. It will always be about business. And the first laws on this planet were really to cover mercantilism on the ocean. The original law of the sea. So it's always about the money, and that's what the founding of the United States was about. It was about a new market. And again, like you had said before, this whole idea about bringing huddled masses yearning to be free into the country, actually it was like, we are hiring, now hiring. So come on over. Because, go ahead.
Finish your thought, Al, but since we have spoken out against the god of this nation, Washington, we do need to say a few other things to justify what we said about him.
All right, well, I'll just do this. This brings us full circle to the idea about the Fed. The Fed has just replaced, as the informer would write, the British Board of Trade. That's a conduit where we're still paying tribute to the crown. Make no mistake about it. And I'll just leave it there because I'll just go into something else, and I don't want to go any further from where I already departed. So go ahead. That's where I'm bringing it. The Fed is powerful, more powerful than our government. Don't think you're ever going to get rid of it.
All right. No, of course not.
Well, I mean, Ron Paul can say whatever he wants to say. It doesn't matter what he says. Nothing gets done. So he comes on after, the last two presidential elections, and he was in others before that, and starts banging on the Fed. And people like the Tea Party and others, patriots, are all behind him because of this. But it's just words. If he ever attempted to do it, he'd be Kennedy'd, if you know what I mean.
Oh, sure, yeah. He'd be Lincoln.
Well, yeah, and there's talk about Lincoln and Kennedy's assassination being tied to messing around, the latter of Kennedy, with the Fed Lincoln with introducing greenbacks and such. That may all be part of it. That is just part of it. It isn't the whole thing. But it is true. You don't mess with the Fed because you wind up dead. That's all there is to it. You're not going to be able to mess with that machine. So, and what's interesting, too, is that every candidate for being the head Fed person never gets rejected by the Congress. So everyone who's gone up there has never been rejected, and that's because it's all show. They have nothing to do with it. It's told to them the way it goes, and all they do is sit there and have this little pageantry and go ahead and confirm whoever's put up there for the position of head of the Fed.
There always has to be a national bank where everything is centralized and the European powers can pick our money, essentially, that ultimately. There has to be that national bank. That's really what the War of 1812 was about. But you see that right at the start of the country, and getting back to good old Georgie boy, he was in cahoots with Alexander Hamilton, and right off the bat, the first thing, I think it may have been the first thing, but Washington set up this national bank as soon as he was elected president, or selected president, perhaps. Washington was a friend to the bankers. He was not even a friend to his soldiers. He wasn't a friend to Americans. Another first thing that he did when we see that the Whiskey Rebellion, when some of his old soldiers had a rebellion, when he called out the federal troops against them, what he did was, and this was an executive action, he created what were called district states to supersede, to overarch the geographical states. In other words, he created legal fictions that would have the power in this country instead of the actual geographic states. And Montgomery goes into this. I don't remember exactly the details. Go check it out yourself. But this is how Washington justified calling out the troops, the federal troops, against some of his own former soldiers in the Whiskey Rebellion. And, of course, he did not even have to do that, as Montgomery outlines. We don't want to get too much into the Constitution on this show, but the Constitution already provided for that. Montgomery tells you how. But Washington wanted to make sure that these legal fictions were in place. That set a horrible precedent for, of course, all of the legal fictions that we ourselves are, the legal fiction corporations with our capitalized names and all of that.
Oh, somewhat tongue-in-cheek, what was created was a parallel universe.
Yeah, and that's what lawyers do.
Yeah.
And then, that's another thing. With these founding fathers, most of them were lawyers. And, when the Pilgrims came over here originally, and for the next century in the history of European settlement of this country, for about 100 years, lawyers were outlawed. The practice of being a lawyer, it was abolished. The Pilgrims, they had seen enough of what lawyers do to people and to a civilization. They knew what Shakespeare and Jesus Christ knew, that lawyers, they hide the keys of knowledge, etc. And how is it that, okay, for the first 100 years, lawyers are outlawed, then look how rapidly, though, after that, the lawyers infiltrated and took over and were running the country. And you look upon these so-called founding fathers, and most of them are lawyers. I mean, they were they were criminals just a few years before.
The worst words that Jesus Christ had for any industry was for the bankers and for the lawyers.
And the religious leaders, yeah.
Yeah, okay, right. But, I mean, what he lays into the lawyers. I mean, what a brood of vipers he calls them. That's great. But you see, that's like we said before, the structure of the world is you create a new market, you create a government, you get the bankers in there, and you get the lawyers in there, and you're ready to go. The next thing you do is create a military to do the bidding of the government. It's complete. And that's the history of the world in 30 seconds. I was going to say also that, remember something, too, that there will always be, for the record, for the official record, there has always been and always will be beauty pieces written on all these government types, and they will always be just glowing, okay? Just understand that that's the way it always has been and always will be. But, like, for instance, to promote Shrub Bush as a Christian so much to the point where I think, was it Time and Newsweek? I keep it somewhere here. And I'm not a Republican or a Democrat, neither are you. We don't even care about parties. It's just to make people think there's a process and that they're really an important part in it, and they're not. And it isn't a process. It's just that it's a complete distraction from allowing people to understand that they're getting screwed no matter who's in office, no matter what administration is in, what party, it doesn't matter.
If people are engaged in the whole Republican-Democrat thing, if that's what absorbs you, then you might as well, to be consistent, you might as well go and become a fan of professional wrestling, the Hulk Hogan thing. Go for it. It's the same thing.
It's wrestling without the mats. That's all.
Yeah.
But I wanted to,
and it's just as fake.
Just to finish that thought about Bush, I'm going to give it, for instance, he was on the cover of Time or Newsweek. I forget which one it was. And, I mean, it made me vomit profusely. They had a cover shot of his head slightly bowed. I believe you can see his hands folded. There was this little luminescence falling upon his pate. The cover title was, "Is he too Christian to be president?" I'm like, oh, you got to be kidding me. I mean, you talk about a Hollywood production. His spirituality is an absolute joke. But that will go down in the record.
It's worse than a joke. That's a blasphemy. The man is a Luciferian.
This is what we're saying, that there'll always be these beauty pieces about these characters. But if you dip back into suppressed history, if you want to find some criticisms of the Constitution, you can read the Anti-Federalist Papers. But that's not ever promoted, really, in school.
They only promote the Federalist Papers.
For the most part, that is true. And so all we're doing is taking a look at the way things really were, taking a look at the situation from other viewpoints. And one of the things I had to laugh at is that having a conversation with the I-Man one time, Patrick Henry was critical, probably the most critical of the big names about the Constitution, and yet he still signed it. And I shook my head and I said to I-Man, why in the world would he do that? Because he knew how bad it was. He's the one that said, today we just tilted more to monarch. And I-Man said, because above all things, he said he was a lawyer.
You and I have talked about another historian, Eric Phelps, a lot. Most of what Phelps expounds upon is amazing and correct. However, he drops the ball when it comes to the Founding Fathers. And he falls for that. He falls for those fluff pieces that portray Washington as a Christian and all these Founding Fathers as great men. All right, so having said that, Eric Phelps, I heard him recently say something where Phelps at least does get it about Jefferson. This is fascinating. I haven't heard this elsewhere. Phelps said, in the mid-1800s, there is a critical book that every American should read, two books actually, that were written by the American inventor Samuel Morse,
yeah.
and who invented the Morse code. Go find those books. You're not supposed to know about them. One of them is called Foreign Conspiracy. Another one is called Imminent Danger. You need to read those books. Okay. Samuel Morse's father was a minister. I forget what denomination. Now, according to Eric Phelps, Samuel Morse's father, who apparently was a contemporary of these Founding Fathers, Morse's father made the public statement that Thomas Jefferson was Illuminatus. That's a direct quote from Phelps, who I guess is a direct quote from Morse's father. That is creepy. Now, how many constitutionalists today, how many patriots who are totally anti-Illuminati, but they just love those Founding Fathers, how would that sit with them? One of their heroes, and it seems to be true from what I've read, it was Illuminati himself, Jefferson.
I guess most of my animus is directed toward him of all the early presidents, because what he said for public consumption was so high blown and platitudinous, and yet his actions belie something entirely different. I mean, and that's the one thing you have to remember about these founders as well. The majority of them were lawyers, bankers, realtors, land barons, and slavers. Okay? So, I mean, Jefferson can say whatever he wants, but the guy was a rake, not a Christian. You can't be a Christian and decide to write your own Bible. So, to me, he was a huge hypocrite, and the one that makes my nostrils, flare the most. Go ahead. You want to add anything to that as well?
Yeah, Jefferson, he was a hypocrite about about the slave thing. He wrote so glowingly about liberty, and yet he had slaves and even fornicated with his slaves, at least one. There's another hypocrisy you could look at in his life, too. He also wrote famous words about the need for revolution. What was it? Every few years, you
got to nourish the tree, the tree of liberty with patriot blood.
Yeah, the needs blood in its roots to the tree of liberty. Yeah, and yet, of all the founding fathers, he did the least fighting of them all. At least Washington was out there in the field. Jefferson never saw any war. It's easy for him to write glowingly about it.
Jeff was a lover.
Yeah, a lover, not a fighter.
Jeff wasn't a fighter. He was a lover. Right. This is going on now. Understand something. We're not banging on these people because we're communists or anything, or we hate this country, or we love this country. I'm just saying what it is. Just calling it straight. And one of the reasons why we're in the fix we're in, and it's going to get deeper, understand something, folks, this is not going to get better. Not because I want it to get worse, because that's the way it is. Nobody understands right now that pretty much they've taken everything that we have. We just don't understand that it's happened yet.
The reason that in general Americans have historically had more freedom than other countries, and you know who writes about this too is Alexis de Tocqueville in, Democracy in America. Our freedoms, our historical freedoms in this country, have a lot less to do with anything the legislators, the founding fathers, or any man have ever done. It has a lot more to do with geography. We were just separated, fortunately, from the old world despotic countries. We were separated from them. We were far away with these big oceans in between us. And to the north and south of us, we didn't have a nation to threaten us either. So people could be left alone, and we had plenty of land to keep marching west. But, of course, now that time's over, and our freedoms are quickly going away.
Honestly, yes. Throughout the history of this country, I would say, and this is not forgetting those people who have been oppressed at all, but the standard of living has been pretty decent relative to everything else. We've had an abundance of a lot of good things. There's no two ways about it. But my point was that that's because we were being fatted and raised for a particular purpose. And I would suggest that purpose was to fill in the void that was left by Great Britain when it no longer could sustain its empire. So a lot like the relationship that you see in the movies with Mad Max, with Master Blaster, Master being the midget that sits upon Blaster, who's a huge Hulk, upon his shoulder. That's pretty much the relationship between the British government and our government, the two countries. And that is they run the show, but they had now us to fight their wars they no longer could. I want to say that we've been as fortunate as we have for that purpose. That yes, militarily we could stop everybody, but we did not run our own show. We were basically hitmen for the syndicate known as Europe. And going back to these glowing accounts of the founders, you had to swallow that stuff to think that we are right. We were somehow birthed the country that is kind of hinted at as being supernatural if you want to bring God into it, and that we were raised up and we really had no problems. But understand that we were still on very weak legs, even by the time of the Civil War. What do you want to call it? 80 years after our inception or whatever, and we did not get knocked off. I mean, there was a reason for the Civil War, and a lot of the instigation came from without this country, not inside this country. But we could have been knocked off then, and that was close, but we weren't. And then from that point on, we played to a certain tune, and we were beefed up, and put out there to do a certain thing for a certain purpose. You look at the two world wars. It would suck to have been brought up in Poland or France during either one of them, and that pain was real. But the United States had no dog in that hunt. And twice we went over there, which was none of our business. And yes, proper liberations did take place, no two ways about it. But we had no stake in that fight. When I hear that, when people would argue with me about it, it's like, well, Britain was our ally. I said, really? What did it ever do for us? Duh. So, fine. And what's going to happen is we're headed for a third one in the Eurasian continent. And that one is going to be our Waterloo. That is going to be our Napoleon at the door of Russia. We're getting ready to get kicked to the curb, but before they do it, they're going to steal our money, and then they'll exact our best blood, and then they'll kick us over, and our reign will be finished with. This is not going to last forever. The United States can be beat, and the script says that it will soon be beat. So, again, getting back to where we're going is we're just trying to find the real United States, looking in the mirror at all the warts and such, just to say, this is how it is. Don't get upset about it. It's been this way forever, and it's happening here. And that's something that American people cannot believe because we always win, we always kick ass, we're always right.
Well, one thing at a time. You mentioned the Civil War, the war between the states, whatever you want to call it. The key to that war, the reason it happened, is not about slavery. As you know, slavery was one issue of many, and it was not the most important one. The reason is you can find the reason by looking at what happened later, right after it, the so-called Reconstruction Acts. When you see what really happened there, that is the reason for that war. In that Reconstruction Act, man, the things we're not told about that. That was actually an act of reconquest is what that was. And whatever, and I'll say it, privileges we were given in the 1787 Constitution, that contract, those were finally done away with once and for all with that Reconstruction. Because what happened in the Reconstruction, well, okay. All right, so, and this is another reason Lincoln was killed. He wanted to welcome the southern states back mercifully. There was a northern rump of Congress at certain states, certain representatives from certain states in the north, not all of them, that wanted to have a conquest. And they did it. They did it. Right after the Civil War, the southern representatives came back. They were lawfully elected, and they even ratified all of those representatives, north and south, right after the Civil War. They even ratified the 13th Amendment, but then the following year, 2 years after the Civil War concluded, the representatives of the South and a couple representatives from the North, they refused to ratify the 14th Amendment. They saw the fine print in that sucker, and it wasn't even fine. There was a big danger with the 14th Amendment. And they refused to ratify it, so the Northern Rump Congress, they took over and sent the troops back in, and they unlawfully threw out the lawfully represented, the lawfully elected representatives of the southern states and New Jersey, and then I think Ohio too. So even in the north, a couple in the north, and that way they passed the 14th Amendment and they put the South under military rule. Or I think it was even martial law at that time, perhaps. But regardless, once you unlawfully prevent a Republican form of government in one or a couple of the states, you therefore destroy the guarantee to a Republican form of government in all of the states. In other words, what they did was violate and destroy forever the 1787 Constitution. That contract was finished with the Reconstruction.
We're going to have to bring this to a close quickly, but if you want to hit some other points, we'll open up the second part with that. But just to recap, also, it is true. What is strange about the Reconstruction Acts is that the southern states were allowed back into the Union as peaceable, but when they didn't play ball with D.C., they were put under military rule again. And I will tell you, from living in the South for the last 20 years, a lot of generational Southerners, could handle the fact that they lost the Civil War, but they could not handle the fact, and it's still these many generations passed on, were upset about what took place with the Reconstruction Acts. And, of course, that also led to the carpetbagging and other things. You could also argue that, again, creating districts once again under military rule has stayed with us forever. And that's another leftover from the Civil War. And there's other things for that, but we'll hit that individually too. So you make a good point, but that's a very strange part also of our history, that they would turn on the southern states, but they don't really tell you why. The other thing I wanted to bring into play too before we end, and that is Shays' Rebellion and the Whiskey Rebellion, if you can find information out about it. There is one book also that comes from a Marxist individual. I understand that. I don't like it. The Marxist, that's another just crummy form of government. But Toward an American Revolution by Jerry Frisia talks about what took place during Shays' and Whiskey Rebellion. It was more than just Shays' Rebellion in the western part of Massachusetts. That's because the colonists, who were now the new state citizens, did not want a federated government. They didn't want a national government, and they didn't want a national bank. And as Theo alluded to, they got all three. They got the bank, and with Washington playing good cop and Hamilton playing bad cop, but that bank had to be in there because it made it easier for the Bank of England and the European bankers to deal with us. Would you agree with that? I mean, on face?
Yes, and when the charter for that original national bank expired, the country didn't want it, wasn't going to renew it, and that was 1811, 1812, and that is why we had the War of 1812. Britain said, oh, no, you don't. You're going to have that national bank again because it's for our benefit.
All right, we got to jump right now. We will be back with the second part. Thank you, Theo, for being with us. And, folks, we'll leave as much information out there for you if you should choose to go that way. And if you don't, I'm going to tell you the same thing is going to happen to you, but you'll never see it coming.